So one of the things that you had brought up is like, what's the narrative going to be for Georgia? And I've been thinking about this matchup a lot really since my drive home from the stadium on Saturday night, right? About what is this going to start to look like for Georgia, And it's interesting because there's depending on the fan that you talk to, right? I know we kind of touched on that. Georgia fans kind of feel like how a lot of Notre Dame fans felt when they were playing Indiana. But when you look at the scope of their schedule, Georgia also has a lot to prove, albeit they are the team to beat right now. But they've done some things throughout the season that is kind of questioned. Are they still the top dog? No pun intended.
Right.
And for now, they have to play the number 4 scoring offense in the country, a team that's won 11 straight, like I said, a team that has won 10 of those games by double digits. So this isn't just some slack team going in to play them. So for Georgia, it's going to be interesting to see where they're at. And when you go, and I know we're about to break down their season, what is that going to look like for them? What is the message in the locker room for them? You know what I mean?
Yeah, because I think there's this notion that Georgia can just turn it on when they want to. And to a degree, that's kind of been true. I mean, they waited until they were down 28-0 against Alabama, but once they turned it on, there wasn't a dang thing Alabama could do to stop them. They came out pissed off and fired up against Texas and smashed them. And look what they did to Tennessee in the second half of that game. Look what they did to Texas in the second half of that game without their starting quarterback. But then this is the same team that should have lost to Kentucky, honestly. This is the same team that had sloppy wins over Auburn and Mississippi State. It's the same team that if DJ Lagway doesn't get knocked out of the game against Florida, who knows how that one goes. It was tied in the fourth quarter. And the same team that got smacked by Ole Miss. And really the game wasn't as close as the final score showed, in my opinion. Ole Miss twice went for 2-point conversions, failed both times. And then also Georgia's only touchdown drive came on the first drive of the game where they intercepted a pass and got the ball deep in Ole Miss territory and then punched it in. And so it's like then they needed overtime, like 8 overtimes to beat Georgia Tech, who finished 7-5. It's a good Georgia Tech team who finished 7-5. We said this before the season, man. If Georgia Tech finishes better than 6-6, that's a heck of a coaching job by that head football coach because their schedule was brutal. I mean, when you look at the 5 teams that Georgia Tech lost to, outside of Virginia Tech, the other 4, this is who they lost to: at Syracuse, who finished 9-3 by 3 points; at Louisville, who finished 8-4, who also lost to a bunch of really good teams outside of Stanford; lost to Notre Dame, and then lost to Georgia, and beat Miami. Beat North Carolina on the road, beat NC State. This is a good football team. But still, Notre Dame beat them convincingly by 18, and it wasn't that close. And then Georgia needed 8 overtimes. Now, that doesn't mean that Notre Dame is going to, Notre Dame beat them by 18 and Georgia beat them by 2. So that means Notre Dame's going to win by 16. Doesn't work that way, right? Football is a game of matchups. But this Georgia team at times this year has looked like in the opener against Clemson. First half, 2 sloppy teams playing in the first game of the year. Second half, throttled Clemson in the second half. Which version of Georgia is going to show up? And I think the expectation is that on the biggest stage, the best version of Georgia will show up. I tend to think that's also true. And so Notre Dame is going to have to be ready for that version of Georgia. And where their D-line are playing at their highest level, where their secondary is playing at its highest level, where the offensive line is playing at its highest level, where the receivers are focused and catching the football. And that's what Notre Dame has to be prepared for, is that version of Georgia.
Well, I think it's interesting, too, and I know you're about to bring up their schedule, but literally, depending on who they played, the list of teams that people thought could beat Georgia fluctuated week over week. You look at the Clemson game, that list was real small, and then you start looking at the Kentucky game, and that list grew quite a bit, and then, you look at the first half of the Alabama game, that list got bigger. Then you look at the second half of the Alabama game, and that list started to shrink. They did what they did to Texas, and then they lose to Ole Miss 28-10. And so it was very much a season of this for Georgia. And the highs were extremely high. You don't beat Clemson, a team that won the ACC 34-3 if you suck. You don't play Texas twice and combined in those games hold them to 60 yards rushing. Now, we were talking before the show, and we do think that is in part to what Steve Sarkisian kind of schemed up in the run game for those games. But at the end of the day, the players still have to go out and execute and hold teams to what they did. And a combined 2 game of, 60 yards rushing is still impressive, right? But then you go out and look, and you give up 226 rushing yards to UMass. You gave up over 300 passing yards to Mississippi State. You gave up over 530 total yards of offense to Georgia Tech at home.
563.
Yeah.
547 to Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so you kind of look at it, and it's the lows are very low, but the highs are very high.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is an interesting team, and I've been watching a lot of film on them too. And Bryan, my takeaway is almost the same as yours. It's like, gosh, when they're at their best, they are, man. Because
they can play with and beat anybody when they play
100%
their best version of themselves.
Mm-hmm. But on the flip side of that coin, when the turnover bug starts creeping in, the secondary's not playing the way that they should, their defensive line isn't fitting the way that they should, they become a very, very, very beatable football team.
Yeah.
So,
But here's some. I want to say something about that, Trevor, because this is what's interesting about this game. I don't think Notre Dame needs them to do that to win this football game.
Sure.
I said this to somebody yesterday. This is the first time that I've felt that, even with the injury to Riley Mills, sure, it gets harder, but even with that injury, this is the first time I felt Notre Dame is on a stage like this against a team like this that I felt didn't need things to go right to win the football game. They just have to play their game. Because I think if Notre Dame plays their game and Georgia plays their game for what we've seen this season, I think Notre Dame's the better football team. That doesn't mean Notre Dame's going to win. It doesn't mean Notre Dame's going to win convincingly. It just means I think if they play their game, if they play their B+ or better game, they're going to win, because then that would keep Georgia from playing their B+ or better game. But I'll say this. You get that hypothetical, well, if they play their A game and they play their A game, who wins? And I've said that's not possible. It's not possible for an entire team to play their A game and the other entire team to play their A game. It could be where both offenses play their A game or both defenses play their A game, but I don't think it's possible for both teams in all phases to play their A game. Usually your A game prevents someone else from being in their A game. It's normally how it goes, right? But if they both did, I just think Notre Dame is the better football team. And I feel that that's true if Carson Beck would have played in this football game. But that also doesn't mean that this Georgia team isn't really freaking good, because they are. I just think Notre Dame's also really good. I think these are two excellent football teams. These are two very talented, excellent football teams. And it's going to be about who comes up with the better plan, who has better preparation, and then who executes that plan on January 1st is really what it's going to come down to. And we'll dive into more things as we get into the next week after Christmas, where we'll talk about, like, what are the things that should constitute that plan? What are the areas where you have some matchup advantages and where you need to take advantage of certain things and protect yourself in other areas. We'll get into some of those specifics as we get into the next week. But, I just, that's how I feel about this game, Trev, is I feel this is a game where you've got two really good football teams. And one of them's going to have to move on and one of them's going to have to go home. And that's how it works in tournament sometimes. Two really good teams, for whatever reason, get matched up against each other early on. And, the loser has to go home, and the winner, you feel like, okay, they've just become a contender. Because I think that's going to be the storyline coming out of semifinals, is the winner of the CFB or the Oregon-Ohio State game, and then the winner of the Notre Dame-Georgia game are going to be viewed as the favorites. That's going to be the key.
This is why you love watching football at this level.
Right.
Because it's not like the regular season where, no disrespect to some of Notre Dame's opponents, but it's not like previewing the Notre Dame-Stanford matchup, right? But on the flip side of that coin, there's some people that are painting this picture that it has to be just some unheard of miracle for Notre Dame to be able to pull this off. And that's just not the case. They're a really good football team. So is Georgia. There's some people that watch Georgia play and they only watch the first half of the UMass game and what they were able to do on the ground, and the Georgia Tech game and the Kentucky game, and that's how they formulate their opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's the same thing on the flip side of the coin. There's some Georgia fans that will only watch the Northern Illinois game and parts of the USC game and say, man, we're going to run this team. Like, it's neither are true, right? These are two really, really good football teams, and that's what's fun about breaking down teams like this at a high level. But for the first time in my lifetime, I do firmly believe that going into this matchup, a miracle doesn't have to happen for Notre Dame to win. It doesn't have to be, Georgia has to play pretty poorly, and Notre Dame just has to play out of their minds and do things that they haven't done all season. Because what they have done all season has been good enough. They have the number 4 scoring offense in the country. They've rattled off 11 straight, so that's what makes breaking this down so interesting. But I wanted to take a look at the Georgia football schedule, right? And just kind of preview, hey, like what got them here? Like what was this long road?
Yeah, this is where we're going to dive into, just talk about Georgia and who they are, right? And so when you look at their schedule, Trevor, what you're going to see is in front of a lot of their opponents, a number sign and then a number, which means a ranked opponent. So this year, Georgia has played 6 teams that were ranked. Well, 5 teams that were ranked. 1 team that was ranked, they played twice. So they've had 6 games where they played a ranked opponent. You see that they beat number 14 Clemson 34-3. They beat number 1 Texas 30-15. They beat number 2 Texas 22-29, and they beat number 17 Tennessee 31-17. They also lost to Bama, number 4 Alabama. At the time, Alabama was number 4, 41-34. In a game they trailed 28-0. And then they lost to number 16 Ole Miss on the road in a 28-10 game. A game that Georgia jumped out to a 7-0 lead. Ole Miss responded immediately with a touchdown drive and then got a field goal to make it 10-7, and Georgia never tied or led again in that game. Throughout the way, Trev, they've had some very interesting wins. At Kentucky, 13-12. I remember watching that game sort of on my drive home. Don't tell anyone, but on my drive home from the Purdue game, watching a little bit of that game on my phone. Sloppy win over Auburn. Sloppy win over Mississippi State. And then what do you do to follow that up? You go out and down to Austin and dominate the Longhorns. Then you have a bye week. You play a Florida team that's, let's be honest, not that good of a team. And you struggle a little bit with them and their freshman quarterback. He gets knocked out, and it took you a while to finally get a lead against, a lead that they couldn't come back from against that Florida team. Got smacked by Ole Miss. Beat Tennessee in a game where they were tied 17, I believe it was 17-17 at halftime, and then Georgia pulled away in the second half. Dominant win over UMass that was kind of ugly, and then had to come down from 17-0 against Georgia Tech to come back and win that game. Anyone that watches that game with an honest assessment looks and says, boy, that's a game where they needed some help, and they got some help. But you also look at some interesting games, Trevor, where when you break it down, some games where they got outgained by Kentucky, got outgained by Alabama, got outgained by Georgia Tech, got outgained by Texas in the rematch, and had some games where they gave up a lot more yards against teams than maybe you thought that they would. So it's been an interesting year for Georgia in that regard, Trevor, when you look at it. But that's a very strong schedule. We've talked all year about how Georgia has the toughest schedule in the country, among the top teams. I would argue that there's other teams that have a tougher schedule relative to who they are, right? But as far as just overall good teams, Georgia had one of the 3 or 4 toughest schedules in the country this year. It got set up relatively well. You had a bye week before the Bama game and a bye week after the Texas game. You ended the season with 3 straight home games. So there's some things that helped them out a little bit there. But that's still, I don't care however you spin it, that's a challenging schedule. And Georgia handled it well. I mean, we talked before the year, this is a team that could go 9-3 and make the playoff. And they went 10-2, which is, I believe, what I predicted them to be was 10-2. And what I did not predict is that they would have a win at Texas and lose at Ole Miss. That's the 2 I would have flipped, and that I did flip in my prediction. I had them losing Texas and beating Ole Miss, but basically their schedule was what we thought it was, and they were who we thought they were from the standpoint of what their record was going to be. I predicted 10-2. And that's what they were, a 10-2 playoff team, and that's what they were. I did not predict them to win the SEC championship, though. So in that regard, regular season, they were who I thought they were. Postseason, I thought that was an impressive win, beating Texas in a rematch. Rematches are hard to do, man. They're hard to win rematches, especially against a team as good as Texas. And Georgia did just that.
When I look at their schedule and I break it down, like it's just the overarching theme of this is it's just a team that doesn't quit. I mean, you have the individual games, right, that you go through and look at. You're down. I think halftime score of that Georgia game or the Alabama game was 30-7 at halftime. I think, which is crazy. You battle back, and I think they tied the game with like a minute 30 left, and then Ryan Williams scored in one play on the next drive.
Yeah.
You go down. What was it? 17-0 against Georgia Tech. Battle all the way back. You force overtime, and then it's that 2-point conversion shootout, and you end up winning the day. Right?
Which,
but
I got to say this. That is the dumbest way to decide a football game.
Yeah.
The dumbest way to decide a football game is that 2-point conversion bullcrap. Just absolutely stupid. But please continue, Trevor.
Oh, I agree. I mean, if you're going to do that, then just have like a field goal kickoff. You know what I mean? I'd rather watch that than I would just 2-point conversion.
Do trick shots or something stupid. I mean, it's just so dumb. So dumb.
No, I agree. But then, you go through and you look at what they did after bad losses. Like you go through and like not bad as in they got killed. Well, they did against Ole Miss, but not bad like a NIU loss or a Michigan loss or an Arkansas loss, nothing like that. But every single time after they lost, they would go on a win streak, right? And each time they rattled off 4 straight. They lost to Alabama in a game that they thought that they had came back. They didn't, and they went on a 4-game win streak, including beating Texas at Texas by 15. They get blown out by Ole Miss in a game that was not competitive. The next week, 7 days later, they go out and they handle Tennessee 31-17, and then they go on and cap it off with a win over the SEC, or a win to get the SEC title, right? So this is a team that has battled adversity this year. And we've talked all year long about, being battle tested and the battle tested team wins. And that's another narrative of this game. You have 2 really battle tested teams going at it on New Year's Day, right? Which just kind of adds more fuel to this. But, look at their schedule overall. To your point, it is weird because you do look at the 13-12 win at Kentucky. For anybody that doesn't just look at the final score of the Florida game, they know that was not a close game. Or it was a close game. Sorry. They know that it was a close game. They hung 59 points on UMass. Defense also gave up 21 points and 226 rushing yards to a team that was 2-8 going into that game. So it's a weird schedule to look at, man.
Some of this you can be like, well, it's the SEC grind and the weekly SEC grind. That doesn't have anything to do with playing Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
That was on September 14th. You had not played any SEC games, and you had just played Tennessee Tech. Mm-hmm. And you had a bye week next week coming up, right? I mean, so that just shows this is an inconsistent football team, but it's still a very talented, inconsistent football team. And they have been tested in ways that Notre Dame hasn't. It's okay to admit that as a Notre Dame fan. They didn't have to play the same schedule Georgia did. What would their record be if they played? I don't know. I know they only played one team on the schedule that Georgia had to play, and Notre Dame beat that team pretty convincingly on the road, whereas Georgia needed overtime, 87,000 overtimes to beat that Georgia Tech team. That doesn't mean Notre Dame would have gone down to Austin and beaten Texas. I have no clue what they would have done against Texas. I just know that Notre Dame beat the one team they had in common, but that doesn't mean a whole lot, right? Because Texas beat teams, more convincingly than Georgia beat teams, and then Georgia goes down and beats Texas twice. That's not how football works. It's a game of matchups. But at the end of the day, Trevor, they had some ugly wins, but you know what? They got the wins they needed. They got the wins they needed to get into the college football playoff, and they earned a right into the SEC championship game, and then they handled business. I did not think they were going to beat Texas again. I did not. I absolutely did not. And Texas thoroughly outplayed them in the first half of that game. But Georgia made the stops they needed to make in the first half to hold Texas to field goals instead of touchdowns that allowed them to stay in that game. And there you go. And I'm so tired of they didn't have Haynes King bull crap. Haynes King, Georgia Tech lost to Louisville by 12 with Haynes King. If anything, having Haynes King would have made it easier for Notre Dame because they didn't have a read on what they're going to do with the Pyron kid at running back. And not having Haynes King is not why they held Georgia Tech to 68 rushing yards and held Jamal Haynes to a career low rushing yards. I'm so tired. No Haynes King. Notre Dame didn't have Benjamin Morrison in that game either. First game without Benjamin Morrison in that game as well. Let's not forget that. So if injuries are part of the game, just like I'm not going to, I don't know without Riley Mills. Now, I'm not making excuses for Notre Dame not being able to beat Georgia because they don't have this player, this player. That's football. Go get it done. Go get it done. So that's a fact. That's an absolute fact. And Notre Dame's also scored 31 points in regulation against that Georgia team, where I believe, what did Georgia have in regulation? Again, it wasn't 31. So I really grow tired of that no Haynes King nonsense. It's just a tired argument because Notre Dame wasn't exactly a beacon of health going into that game either. So anyway, that's just a frustrating mantra that we see about that game that drives me nuts. But that's how Georgia got here. That's their path to getting here, Trev. And when you look at this Georgia team statistically, this is not your typical dominant Georgia football team, but this is also, you have the context for these rankings. There's not a lot of impressive rankings here, right? So red zone offense ranks 4th. Of all the statistics that we measure here, there's only one statistic where Georgia ranks in the top 10, and that's in red zone offense. But the thing that you have to take into consideration is they have played a schedule that has some very good offenses and some very good defenses on it. And that's something that I think that properly understanding Georgia's schedule is going to give you a better understanding of why they rank where they rank. Now, some of their inconsistency is why they only rank 29th in scoring and why they only rank 21st in scoring defense. But it was going to be impossible to finish in the top 10 on offense and defensive scoring when you play Texas twice, Ole Miss on the road, Bama on the road, Clemson on a neutral field, Georgia Tech, Tennessee, right? Like, you're not going to finish in the top 10 in those categories when you have that schedule. So that context needs to be understood when you do look at some of these overall numbers. But it doesn't put into context how low they are in certain numbers. And that's the thing, Trev. So let's kind of talk through their offense and go through their rankings here as an offense of where they've been.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you go through and you look, I think you said it perfectly, is we just pulled up their schedule for good reason. And I think it kind of backs why some of their numbers are what they are, right? Some of. Now, I go through and I look, and I'm thinking back to the schedule that they played. I mean, I know Tennessee had a pretty good rush defense. Texas, I think, was up there in a lot of their defensive rankings, but being 98th in the country, it's not like if they didn't play those teams, they go from 98th to 20th, right? So this is, I have a couple articles coming out about this, but it's weird because this is an uncharacteristic Georgia team, like similar to the narrative of like Notre Dame is where we thought that they were. They just got here in a different way than we pictured. It's kind of the same way for Georgia. It's weird looking at it, and you see that they only have 129 yards on the ground average per game. It's weird seeing them rank, 98th in the country with that. You look at their yards per rush, that's 80th in the country. You look at their turnovers. You look at, like, they haven't really taken care of the football that much. They're like 104th in the country in interceptions. Because Carson Beck went on that streak of where he had like 7 interceptions across 3 games. I mean, it was a rough outing. The red zone offense is really good. They rank overall in turnovers 71st in the country. And then the other one that kind of jumps out to me too is their secondary, like their pass defense. You go and you look at passing yards allowed. It's not awful, but it's not like characteristic of what we had seen before, right? But the one that jumps out to me is interceptions. This Georgia defense in the past has feasted on turning the football over, and they currently rank 93rd in the country in interceptions. Now you wouldn't think that based on all the hype that the secondary gets and being led by Malachi Starks and him being a Jim Thorpe Award finalist. But
and these freaking the fact that, look, Malachi Starks is a heck of a player. Yeah. He's probably going to be a high draft pick for all I know. I don't really care. I don't really care about the NFL draft. But the reality is there's no world in which he was a better player than Xavier Watts this year. And yet the Football Writers Association of America put him on the first team simply because of reputation. It's absolutely absurd. Absolutely freaking absurd. So, yeah, that still pisses me off. I'm just going to be honest with you. It's not to mean that he's not a heck of a football player. It just pisses me off. There are 2 safeties that were better than every other safety this year. That was Xavier Watts and Caleb Downs. So anyway, but to your point, Trev, their secondary has been an issue for them this season. And here's the crazy thing. Keep I just like some of those numbers are interesting, especially when you consider they really shut Texas down both times. That's the interesting thing about that is they shut down Texas both times on both times that they played.
I think another thing that's interesting too, is you look at what they have given up. And again, I have this coming out later, but they ranked 71st in the country in pass plays of 30 yards or longer allowed. They ranked number 70th in the country in pass plays of 40 yards or longer allowed. They rank 83rd in the country in pass plays of 10 yards or longer. They've given up 110 of those. And so this isn't the typical lockdown Georgia secondary that people are used to seeing. I mean, Xavier Watts and Adon Schuler have combined for more interceptions through 13 games than the entire Georgia defense has. Those guys each have, I think, 9 because Xavier Watts got a pick in the Indiana game. So now he has 6 on the season. Adon Schuler has 3. So, I think that's interesting. They don't get after the quarterback as well from a defensive line standpoint. I know they rank 20th in the country in sacks, but they have a very, very active linebacking core. If there is a part of this defense that is the typical Georgia type defense, those linebackers are good, man. They rotate well. They can play all over the field. So their linebacking core makes up for a lot of these numbers. Their linebackers are really good in the run game. They're good at disrupting plays in the backfield. So, it's interesting when you look at the makeup of this Georgia team as a whole. And when talking about sacks, it's even weird looking at what their offensive line is allowed this year. They rank 51st in the country in sacks allowed. And similar to the conversation that I had around Curtis O'Rourke, is there's a direct correlation between when Carson Beck started getting pressured. Now, I know that's not really going to be a narrative for this game.
Yes.
But when Carson Beck got pressured, he turned the ball over. And I know Notre Dame's not facing Carson Beck, but they're facing a guy going into his first collegiate start. So we'll see what happens with Gunnar Stockton. But, the offensive line has struggled at times to not only protect the quarterback, but to gain a push in the run game. So, statistically, this team is interesting. And it does help when you look at the schedule with a little bit of context. But, this is an interesting football team to kind of dive into, man.
So let's talk a little bit about their offense and defense, a little bit more specifically. We saw their statistics. You see where they rank. They rank 29th in the country in scoring offense, 46 in yards, 11th in passing yards, 98th in rushing yards. Here's the interesting thing about this matchup. That has to basically kind of go out the window in this matchup because of no Carson Beck. And what I mean by that is they're going to look like a very different team offensively, in my opinion. If they try to, I just don't think Georgia's going to come out. I mean, Kirby Smart didn't get to 2 title games where he won and then played for another championship because he's an idiot and doesn't know football. I don't see them going into this game saying, hey, we're going to ask Gunnar Stockton against a top 5 pass defense in his first career start to throw the ball all over the field the way we asked Haynes King to do in the regular season. I just don't see it. Now, are they going to throw the ball? Yeah, they're going to throw the ball. Are they going to just come and be a ground and pound, running up the middle every single play, hope to win 10-7? No, they're not going to do that either. They're going to look more like some of Kirby's older teams, right? I think they're going to look more like 2017 stylistically than they have the last 4 or 5 years. Because Georgia has not been a dominant a rushing football team really for a couple years, for several years. I mean, even their title teams could run the ball well, but they weren't like that elite rushing team. Last year, Georgia had a pretty good rushing offense. They averaged 190 yards throughout the season, but they kind of beat up on some teams at times. And then at other times, their running game looked bad. They were very schizophrenic. 190 against South Carolina, 291 against Vanderbilt, 300 against Ole Miss, 262 against Georgia Tech, 372 against Florida State, 99 against Ball State, 159 against Tennessee Martin, 107 against Auburn, 131 against Missouri, 156 at 3.9 against Tennessee, 78 against Alabama. A little schizophrenic on offense or rushing the football. They ran for 205 in 2022, but again, it wasn't when they were at their best, they were a team that was running the ball, but throwing the ball down the field and hitting their big tight ends. They haven't been that just ground and pound, just run the ball and quarterbacks got to manage the game like Jake Fromm. They haven't been that team. They've been more of an up-tempo, not up-tempo. They've been more of an explosive offensive football team from like 21 to 2023 that, yes, they ran the ball to, I think, 205 and 22. I think they were in the 190s when they won it 21. Let me look. It was 191 in 2021. Didn't have 1,000-yard back either year because they split carries. 21, it was Amir White, James Cook, Kenny McIntosh, Kendall Milton. Then in 2022, it was McIntosh, DeJuan Edwards, Kendall Milton, Branson Robinson. Like they threw for a bunch of yards in all those years. You know, I mean, Stetson Bennett threw for over 4,000 yards in 2022, the year that they won their second title, right? And so they've been more of a high-scoring, take your shots, big play football team. And the running game was a quality part of their game, but it wasn't the bread and butter that it was in 17 for that football team.
Right.
And I think this is going to look more like that team offensively than it has the great title teams, just because of who they have at quarterback. And that's not a knock on Gunnar Stockton, because he's a good quarterback. He was a 4-star kid coming out of high school. He was a kid to put up some monster numbers in high school as a thrower and a runner. It's more about his style of play and his inexperience. So you're not going to ask him to say, hey, go be Carson Beck. That's number one, just experience-wise alone, that would be a bad decision, because Notre Dame can prepare for that offense. Notre Dame's going to know what that offense is. They're going to know what you like to do with Carson Beck. They're not going to necessarily know what Gunnar Stockton is quite as good at. So you want to take advantage of that. But the other thing, too, is you got to fit into what this kid does well. Yeah, he can make some plays with his arm. He did that against Texas early on, especially. The little sprint out they did where he throws it over the top, gets to the tight end as they kind of took that first drive of the second half where he starts, they go right down the field on Texas and punch that sucker in the end zone. And he made some plays with his arm, but he also ran the ball. They ran a quarterback draw. He scrambled. And you're going to see them play to that a little bit more, Trev, and lean on the talented running backs. Trevor Etienne and Nate Frazier are guys I think you're going to see a bigger part of what they're doing. And then with their receivers, because they are they don't have a lot of big receivers. Like there's no Javon Wims. There's no AD Mitchell. There's no like their tight ends are very good, but they're not Brock Bowers, right? Like they're more 5'11", 6 foot, 6'1", fast guys outside of Dylan Bell. So I think what you're going to see them do is have a very short to deep pass game. Short stuff to kind of first and second down, chain moving plays. If Notre Dame's playing off, hit some slide throws, hit some, some under screens, they like to throw a lot of swing routes to the running backs. They'll do some shovel passes to their slots, with Smith and Anthony Evans. But then I think you're going to see them take some shots down the field off play action. But it's all going to be, in my opinion, it's going to be built around their desire to run the football. Notre Dame not having Riley Mills, I think, is going to add to their desire to run the football, because they're going to look at Notre Dame and say, there's no 300-pound Riley Mills there now with 316-pound Gabriel Rubio. It's 316 Rubio with 285 Howard Cross and 275 Donovan Heinisch. I think they're going to go at Notre Dame. And so that's why these statistics that you look at are a little bit meaningless when it comes to how Georgia Tech is going to attack Notre Dame. The question, however, where these numbers do matter is, can Georgia be effective running the football on Notre Dame? That's going to be the bigger question. Not whether or not they'll try to run it on Notre Dame. I think that's a given for all the reasons I just mentioned. The question, Trev, based on what we see right there is, okay, cool, but can they be effective at it? And when you look at their numbers, they went for 208 against UMass. Their next highest rushing output on the season is 169 against Clemson. Next is 166 against Tennessee Tech. And then after that, it's a pair of 146 games against Florida and Mississippi State. They've averaged under 4 yards a carry 7 times in 13 games. They've averaged under 4.5 yards a carry in 2 more games, Florida and Texas. Florida and Georgia Tech. So the question is not, will Georgia try to run the ball more? I think that's a given. The question is, can they do it? I do think part of it was their offensive line was banged up a lot during the year. They had some issues at tackle. Their center, Jared Wilson, missed a couple games. Drew Bobo had to get some starts in there. They're a lot. Tate Ratledge, I think, was banged up at times this season. That 3 weeks off, I think, could help their offensive line get back to being healthy, get back to being on the same page and play better. But does that mean they all of a sudden go become a team that can run for 200 yards a game again? That's the question that we're going to find out on January 1st.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're going against a very underrated rush defense in Notre Dame. So like it isn't as lopsided of a matchup as what some people think. Notre Dame against Power 5 opponents ranks number 16 in the country in rush defense. They allow just a little hair over 111 yards a game on the ground, right? I think they are at basically 3.4 yards per carry allowed. And then you kind of look at where Georgia's at in the run game, and they're averaging like 4.2 yards per rush. So, it's going to be interesting to see what Notre Dame does without Riley Mills. But I agree with you 100%. It's not going to be if Georgia runs the ball. They will run the ball because that's what turned the game around against Texas. I think you said it when we were breaking down the game afterwards. It's just what got Georgia back into that game is they went back to who they were, what got them there in the first place. I'm not talking about what got them there in like this season. Like what got Georgia on the map, got them over that hump to start beating these teams is they went back to what their identity was. And so it's going to be, a testament to, are they going to be able to do that now in the playoffs with Gunnar Stockton, who adds a little bit of a different dynamic to this offense than what Carson Beck did. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do, because you have to let the kid go out and be an athlete, right, and do what he does best. But also Notre Dame, what they've shown on defense, they can lay the wood on some people, man.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to put your quarterback at risk of getting hurt, because who knows what you have past Gunnar Stockton. Oh, it's that true freshman. But, it kind of narrative
You'd have Jaden Rashada, right? But they've
yeah.
redshirted him all year, which doesn't matter now. They can play him now because the red shirt's is still there. And I've heard some people are like, do you think they try to sneak a Jaden Rashada in there? Maybe. I don't think that really matters. I mean, I'd kind of welcome that a little bit, to be completely honest with you, because that tells me they want to become this throwing it all over the field team if they did that. But yeah, I thought that was interesting, Trevor, do they go that route with Jaden Rashada? And, I highly doubt that he's going to go from playing like not at all. I don't think he threw a pass all season. I don't know that he played a snap all season. I'm actually going to look up their numbers right now. I don't think he played all season. That was part of the deal when they recruited him he didn't play a snap all season. Carson Beck played 846, Gunnar Stockton played 80, and then Colin Drake played 3. That was the deal when they recruited him, is you're going to come here in redshirt and take the year off. Do they yank that now that they're in the postseason and their quarterback is hurt? I don't know the answer to that. I'd be a little surprised by that.
I would be too. But end of the day, it's going to be interesting to see what Georgia's offense is going to be able to do. But stats aside, Brian, like we kind of go through, what makes this offense good? Like what are they good at? And, from your perspective, just wanted to hear like and I know it's going to be interesting with Carson Beck being out, because a big part of their offense was being able to push the ball down the field. But when you look at this Georgia offense, what makes them dangerous? What poses the biggest threat to Notre Dame?
You asking me what I think it is?
Yeah.
I think right now it's they're pushing Notre Dame around up front. That's my biggest fear. And then getting Notre Dame to have to bring their safeties into the box to defend the run, and then now you're taking your over-the-top shots to their fast guys. Arian Smith can fly.
Yeah.
He can run. Dominic Lovett's got really good quickness. He's a guy that can make some plays. He's a guy that's been playing in the SEC for a while at Missouri, and now Georgia. It's getting their tight ends down the field on play action shots against the linebackers and safeties. It's playing downhill with their run game and downhill with their throwing game. That's my big concern about this game. If this becomes a game where they're going to try to drop him back and throw it all over the field, I feel good about that, because now it's your big physical lineman against Notre Dame's athleticism in space, and I like that. It's your receivers who are good but not elite against Notre Dame's really talented pass defense. I think you're playing into Notre Dame's hands at that point in time. I think running downhill and throwing downhill is the recipe for Georgia. And that doesn't mean they can do it, but that's what I think they're going to do. I just think, because look, Trev, let's look at their offensive side of the ball, right? Their starting offensive line, when healthy, left to right, is Monroe Freeling, Dylan Fairchild, Jared Wilson, Tate Ratledge, and Xavier Truss. This is their size across the board, left to right. Monroe Freeling, 6'7", 315. Dylan Fairchild, 6'5", 315. Jared Wilson, 6'3", 310. Tate Ratledge, 6'6", 320. Xavier Truss, 6'7", 320. Like, that's what they are. They're big. They're big and they're physical. And I think with what they have going down, I see them trying to go back to, and again, that's not me sounding like I'm some like know-it-all rocket scientist. I watched the second half of that game. I watched Gunnar Stockton in high school. And I also think Kirby Smart's a pretty smart guy. And if I'm Notre Dame, I'm going to do the thing that I'm most concerned about. If I'm going against Notre Dame, I'm going to do the thing that as a Notre Dame person, I'm going to say this. I'm going to predict they do the thing that I'm most worried about because I think they're smart coaches. And that's what I think is most concerned about, is being able to run right at Notre Dame. And then that sets up the downfield shots as the safeties and linebackers have to start. Because if they start pushing the offensive line off the board, off the line, now the linebackers got to trigger more. Now the safeties have to come down and protect the linebackers who are triggering more, which opens up some of the RPO game, which opens up the play action game, which opens up the movement throwing game with Gunnar Stockton. I think all those things play into their hands. Georgia, and we'll talk about this in the keys to the game, but if looking at it from the Georgia standpoint, if they can establish line of scrimmage, that changes everything. If they can't, then they're in trouble. They're going to struggle to score a lot of points. So to me, that's why I believe they're going to play that way, which is going to be the reverse of what we see from them on film and statistically. But that's also, Trev, what I think we saw from them in the second half of that Texas game. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what turned the game around for them. Like you and I both talked about, like they just went back to being Georgia. Like they went back to being this downhill, run it out you. We're going to just rely on our, two good running backs. Trevor Etienne was back healthy and our really, really big offensive line. But I think you brought up a good point that this is going to be a matchup for Notre Dame that's kind of won and lost in the trenches.
Mm-hmm.
Marcus
Right.
Freeman has been we're an O-line, D-line driven program, and you're going to need that now more than ever because another side of the ball that has really good size for Georgia is their defensive line.
Right.
Kind of transitioning over into just talking about their defense here. We talked on it earlier, and we mentioned some of the issues that their secondary had, but up front, Georgia's defensive line has some pretty good guys on it. And some guys that I really wasn't expecting to kind of break out the way that they did, like the Chaz Chambliss guy. Like he wasn't really a big part of their defense last year, and this year he's tied for the league or for the lead in sacks for the team. I do think that the bulk of this defense is kind of carried by their linebacker play because their linebackers are really good. Jalen Walker is a really, really good linebacker. But overall overview of Georgia's defense, what are you seeing, Brian?
Well, obviously they're still a 3-4 team. Right. And so like they're going to line up in different ways. You're going to have three different players coming off the edge. Chaz Chambliss is, not a guy that I would call an off-ball linebacker, right? I mean, he's a linebacker, but he's coming off the edge. Jalen Walker plays all over. He'll come off the edge. He'll blitz up the middle. Michael Williams is a dude, and they're big. I mean, you talked about the size. Nazir Stackhouse, this is their starting defensive line in their 3-down look. They're going to do their odd front, right? A lot of that. They'll do some junk fronts on 3rd down like Notre Dame does, like a lot of teams do now. They do a lot more situational football and substitution football than they did in the past. They've kind of adapted to teams that can throw and 3rd down packages than more than they have in the past, just because they needed to. Not that that hurt them in the past, because that just wasn't where college football was when they were first coming along. Now it is, and they've adjusted fine. But Nazir Stackhouse is 6'3", 320. Warren Brinson, 6'4", 310. Kristen Miller is 6'4", 305. They're also going to play a lot of Tyrion Ingram Dawkins, who's 6'5", 280, as one of their ends. And then, of course, off the edge, you've got, I think he's what they call him as their star, is Michael Williams, who's an absolute monster when he wants to be. Now, he's 6'5", 265. You also have Damon Wilson, who was a big-time recruit a couple years ago. He'll come off the edge. He's 6'4", 250. They have some very athletic edge players, and that's the biggest concern, is the combination of size up front and athleticism off the edge. When that group is not playing motivated football, teams run and throw on them. When that group is playing aggressive physical football like they did in both games against Texas, they're a very hard team to move the football on. And so if you're Notre Dame, you better expect to get their best because of the stakes of this game. But I think that's the thing that looks at is it all starts and ends in their defensive success with their front seven. Their secondary is just solid. That's it. It's not a great secondary as a whole. Obviously, Malachi Starks is a very good player, and they're not a bad secondary, Trevor. They're just not – this isn't a typical Georgia second. This isn't like, Eric Stokes and Tyree Cleveland at corner, right? This isn't that. They are vulnerable to throwing the football, but Notre Dame isn't a team that's been able to take advantage of that against a lot of teams this year. They're not a team that lives and dies off of throwing the ball all over the yard the way that Ole Miss was able to take advantage of it because of who they had. Now, they didn't have Trey Ayers, but they still had a pretty darn good receiving core. So Notre Dame's going to have some guys step up in the pass game. But when you look at Georgia specifically, and we're focusing on Georgia right now, that's the part of their team right there that when they're dominant, that part of their team is dominant. When they struggle, teams have found answers for that. What Ole Miss did to them is Ole Miss just went fast. And they were just not able to get lined up. They negated their size and power a little bit. And that's what helped Ole Miss. I don't know that Notre Dame can replicate that because that's not necessarily who Notre Dame is. I think they should try because we've seen them push the tempo at times. But to me, Trev, this Georgia team is what they've always been. I don't know that they're as talented as everywhere. They're young in some spots. I think that kind of hurts them a little bit as well. But they've had a couple injuries here and there. But I think that's the thing is their front seven, especially their edge players, Michael Wilson and Damon Wilson, and Michael Williams and Damon Wilson are two of the most gifted, athletically gifted edge players that Notre Dame will have faced this year. Not necessarily the best. They're in the conversation without a doubt, especially Michael Williams. Damon Wilson is going to be the next star edge rusher at Georgia. I mean, he's going to be a dude someday. So when you look at that group, that's where they're at. And then the other thing, too, we talked about injuries, right? Munden's been banged up a lot this year. He's only played 9 games. He was back against Texas. He's now going to have 3 weeks of rest. So I expect their inside backers to be a lot more fresh and healthy as well. And you've got them. You've got, obviously, Jalen Walker. You've got C.J. Allen. You've got Raylan Wilson. They play kind of 4 guys on top of having Michael Williams and Damon Wilson and Chaz Chambliss coming off the edge. So their front 7, when it's on, is really good. When it's not, it's not. And that's been the biggest problem for Georgia this year. When you look at like what we talked about, look at this. Like, why did they give up 547 yards to Bama? Why did they let Mississippi State move the ball all over them? Why did they struggle against Ole Miss and Georgia Tech? Their defensive line did not dominate those games. Why did they dominate Texas both times? Because their D-line dominated. Why were they able to whip Clemson? Because their D-line and their front 7 dominated. And that's really the key about this Georgia defense is when their front 7 is playing at their best, they are very, very, very difficult to move the ball and score on. But as you see, by them giving up over 20 points a game this year, teams have been able to do just that. And that's going to be the big key. And Notre Dame is going to, if Notre Dame's going to just kind of come out and play slow, methodical offense, I feel like they're playing right into Georgia's hands. It lets them get into their stunts. They love to do that late shifts to try to get you some false starts. We've seen Notre Dame have a couple false starts this year against teams that do that. Get your zone rules, get your duo rules, whatever done. And then all of a sudden, boom, they just have this real quick dramatic shift. When they've got time to get their calls in, get everybody lined up, do their pre-snap movement, that's when you're playing right into their hands. The teams that have had success against them this year are teams that have been able to push the tempo. Is Notre Dame going to be able to do that? We're going to find out. We'll talk more about that next week. But that's the big thing is when they're able to play big boy football, Trev, this team is really hard to move the ball on defensively.
Yeah, Georgia's front 7 is kind of who they've always have been. They don't – you and I were talking before the show. They don't have Jalen Carter. They don't have a Jordan Davis. They don't have Nakobe Dean. But they still have some really, really good players. And their identity is still they're big, they're long, and they're fast. But athletic, right? Their linebackers do really good jobs. Covering sideline to sideline. They do really good in the run game. So I think that makes it all the more interesting. And I think you said it perfectly. When their defensive line dominates and when their front 7 is playing good football, it's almost to a degree, like obviously Georgia's significantly better than what Florida State's defensive line was. But from like a talent perspective, we had conversations in the Florida State game around when Florida State's defensive line wants to play, they're really good. But it was just, unfortunately for them, they just never wanted to play.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And I would argue their edge rushers aren't super far off from Georgia's guys athletically, but they're not as good football players, which is why Marvin Jones didn't play a whole lot at Georgia and transferred to Florida State. Right. The difference is their big guys are a little, or how do I say this nicely? Their big guys play a little bit more consistently than Farmer and especially Jackson at Florida
Yeah.
State.
Yep.
Because this group wants to play better. Again, I think there's been games where not necessarily they didn't. It's not that they didn't want to play well. It's that other teams were able to do some things to them to because like they're big physical guys. They're a true 3-down defense. When teams would go tempo and movement, I mean, there's times when Ole Miss is snapping the ball and the Georgia kids are just getting their hands into the dirt, getting into their stance.
Right.
That's when you're going to be able to beat them. When you just line up and say, okay, we're going to come at you at 12 personnel all day. Maybe Notre Dame is able to run on them doing that. We'll see, I guess. You know what I mean? But you're going to have to be able to mix it up. And teams that have been able to push them with a little bit of tempo, Georgia Tech did that. You know, the motions, the jets, the getting out of the pocket, the misdirection, all those different things gave Georgia a lot of problems. They were able to push the tempo at times, mix it up, run pass. Those are the teams that have given them problems. Alabama pushed the tempo against them, you know, getting Jalen Milroe, you know, really going out of the pocket and in the run game. All those things played big roles. Teams that just line up and say, like Tennessee, early on, just, hey, we're just going to line up and run the ball at you. And it worked for a quarter and a half. Then Georgia shut it down, and Tennessee couldn't do a dang thing in the second half.
Sure.
Right? I mean, that's to me, that's real. Clemson, you know, didn't really push the tempo incredibly well with their run game, and Georgia just kept everything in front of them and just dominated it. And Texas, the same thing. You know, I didn't think Texas did a very good job of really putting Georgia into binds with their tempo and their movement and things like that. They just were like, hey, we're going to do what we do. And, you know, not having Kelvin Banks really hurt them in the rematch. Let's be honest about that too. But I don't know that he would have made that much of a difference with their run game. Maybe he'd have helped in a little bit in pass pro, but in the run game, I don't know if it would have made that much of a difference because I think Sark coached a little bit afraid of that front. And that's the other thing too, is you can't be it's a really good front, but you can't be afraid of it. You can't be like, well, we're scared, so we're just going to run quick pitches and outside zone and, you know, and tosses and sprint outs all game because we're afraid of the front. You got to be willing to go at it. You just also have to go at it the right way. And that's going to be a key for Notre Dame. But the other thing too, Trev, they're a good third down defense. They're not great at forcing turnovers, and they turn the ball over a decent amount. That's another part of their team that's been a bit of an issue this year. And that's what allowed Texas to really get back in that game was that really bad Gunnar Stockton turnover at the end of that game too, right? I mean, Georgia's getting ready to go put that game away against like, oh, you needed overtime against Texas. Well, yeah, that's true, but they were on the verge of making it not needing overtime in that game before he threw that pick. So that's going to be an interesting part of it too. But I think they're going to try to protect Gunnar Stockton and not ask him to go win the game. And that means their defense is going to be locked and loaded. It's honestly for them, it's a lot like what we talked about yesterday with Notre Dame. Hey, how do you protect against, you know, not having Riley Mills? Hey, Notre Dame offense, it's time for you to step up and help the defense out. Well, same thing's going to be true here. Hey, defense, we don't have our quarterback. We're going to, you know, we need you guys to step up and play the best game you've played all year. And that's going to be the storyline. And which of those two units, and which I love about that makes this an even more interesting game, Trev, is that puts the two units that have to step up to protect the other side in direct battle against each other. And that's why, I mean, that's what I love about these type of games. You know, is that right? Hey, the defense is going to have to step up and help the offense out for Georgia. The Notre Dame offense is going to have to step up and help the Notre Dame defense out because of their personnel loss. Which one is able to get that done? That's going to largely determine how this game goes. And, you know, that's a fun part of it. It really is.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really exciting, you know, and it puts it into what's going to win the day. You know, the last little nugget that I have about Georgia's defense is I kind of look at they're also not the same red zone defense that they've been in years past either. You know, like what they're hanging their hat on is hopefully just teams aren't able to move the ball on them. But when they are, teams will typically come away with points, right? I mean, 2 teams this year scored into the 40s against Georgia's defense, which is not really something that you've seen in past years. I mean, you know what I mean? Like it's even when they would play Alabama, whether it be in the national championship or the SEC championship game, like Alabama wasn't scoring 41. Those were those like 23-19 games.
There was the one time in the 21 SEC title game.
That's right.
That they went for 41. And then what happened when they had the rematch?
Yeah.
Bama's offense couldn't do anything. Now they ended up losing John Mechie and and Jameson Williams. But even with that, they were still better. But what was Alabama able to do in those games to get them in trouble? Get them into space.
Yep.
Teams that can make it a space game have had success. A tempo game have had success against this Georgia defense. Teams, and that's the mistake Notre Dame made both times. They tried to play, hey, we're going to line up. We're going to run our offense. We're going to go with we're not going to go with much pace. We're just going to line up, do our thing, trust our elite offensive line in 2017. And it's like, yeah, but if you're not going to do anything to go at them in space and do some things, you're going to have trouble moving the ball. They did the same thing in 2019. They were completely unwilling, despite the fact Georgia playing the whole game with their backup corners, to attack them down the field. They did it twice. And what happened? Lawrence Keys beat a guy for a go ball, and Chase Williams beat a guy for a go ball. And then that's it. That you're going to have to be willing to do those things. They want you to do those things so that you're somewhat playing into their hands, but you also have to do those things in order to beat them and to back them off. And we're going to find out if Notre Dame's going to be able to do that. So,
Yep, absolutely. And it's a good transition into, the next segment of the show. But before we do, nobody go anywhere because we still have a lot of things that we're going to cover today. So before we move on to the next segment, be sure to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit that notification bell, share this podcast with your friends and family. And of course, the best way to support what we do here at Irish Breakdown, make sure you go to boards.irishbreakdown.com. Sign up for the premium message board. That's where all the good content comes out, man. I mean, that's where you're seeing the film breakdowns. That's where you're seeing exclusive articles. So a lot of good stuff on there at boards.irishbreakdown.com.